November 17, 1944. 23 miles southwest of Leyte Gulf, Philippine Sea, Lieutenant Commander Teramoto Kunikazu pressed his face against the rubber eyepiece of I-26's attack periscope, scanning the grey water ahead. The submarine crept forward at 4 knots, her electric motors barely audible. Inside the pressure hull, the air was thick with humidity and the smell of unwashed bodies. 105 men breathed the same recycled atmosphere, waiting. "Hydrophone contact, Captain," the sound operator whispered. "Multiple screws, destroyer type, bearing 035, range 2,000 meters." Teramoto acknowledged with a slight nod. His crew had been tracking American warships since dawn, positioning I-26 for an attack on the supply convoy. Intelligence reported would pass through this area. The submarine had maintained perfect silence. No transmissions, no periscope observations longer than 30 seconds. Every procedure followed exactly as doctrine required. They were invisible. At 0900 hours, the hydrophone operator's voice changed. "Captain. Active sonar. Very close. They are searching in our sector." Teramoto's hands tightened on the periscope housing. American destroyers used sonar constantly, sweeping empty ocean in systematic patterns. This was expected, but something in the operator's tone suggested this was different. The pings were not random. They were methodical, deliberate, converging. "Rig for silent running," Teramoto ordered. "All stop. Make depth 150 meters." I-26 descended into darker water, tilting bow down as her diving planes bit into the current. The crew moved like ghosts, each man aware that any noise could mean death. Teramoto watched the depth gauge needle swing past 100 meters, 120, 140. At 153 meters, the submarine leveled off beneath the thermal layer that should deflect sonar waves away from her hull. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The control room was absolutely silent. Condensation dripped from overhead pipes onto the steel deck plates. The air circulation fan hummed softly. Outside the hull, the Pacific Ocean pressed against I-26 with crushing force. Teramoto calculated their position mentally. They were 68 nautical miles from the nearest American-controlled port. The submarine had been submerged for 14 hours. Battery capacity remained at 83%. Provisions and fuel were adequate for another 37 days at sea. Additional contacts, the hydrophone operator reported, his voice barely audible. "Multiple destroyers. They are moving toward our position." Teramoto felt something cold settle in his stomach. I-26 had done nothing to reveal her presence. She had not fired torpedoes. She had not transmitted on radio. She had not remained at periscope depth long enough for visual detection. She had not violated any of the tactical principles that kept submarines alive. Yet 4 American destroyers were converging on her exact position, with what seemed like certain knowledge of where she was. "Engine room, prepare for emergency power. We may need speed." The engineering officer responded immediately. "Battery ready, Captain. Approximately 1 hour at full power available." 1 hour. Against 4 destroyers with sonar and depth charges, 1 hour would not be enough. Teramoto had read the casualty reports. Japanese submarines were disappearing at accelerating rates. 28 boats lost in the first 10 months of 1944 alone. More than half the submarine force that entered the war was gone, and Teramoto was beginning to understand why. At 0922, the first pattern of depth charges detonated 100 meters above I-26's hull. The explosions hammered through the water like the fists of an angry god. Steel groaned. Light bulbs shattered. Men grabbed for handholds as the submarine rolled 15 degrees to starboard. Teramoto gripped the periscope housing, his face expressionless, his mind racing through tactical options that were narrowing with each passing second. The Americans knew where he was. The question was how. To understand the shock that Japanese submarine commanders experienced in late 1944, One must understand what the Imperial Japanese Navy believed about submarine warfare when the Pacific War began. Japanese naval doctrine treated submarines as offensive weapons designed to scout for the combined fleet and attack enemy capital ships. This fundamental principle shaped every aspect of Japanese submarine design, training, and tactical employment. The Imperial Navy had developed this doctrine over 2 decades of careful study and investment. Japanese strategists believed the decisive naval engagement would occur in the Western Pacific, where American forces advancing across the ocean would meet the combined fleet in a climactic battle. Submarines would weaken the enemy before this engagement by sinking carriers, battleships, and cruisers. Attacking merchant shipping was considered secondary, almost beneath the dignity of submarine forces. This stood in stark contrast to German doctrine, which focused U-boats almost exclusively on commerce raiding. Japanese submarine design reflected these priorities. The Type B submarines, including I-26, displaced between 2,700 and 3,400 tons, submerged. They stretched over 350 feet in length and carried crews averaging 100 men. These were large, capable vessels, designed for extended independent operations across the Pacific's vast distances. Cruising range exceeded 16,000 nautical miles. Some variants carried floatplanes for reconnaissance. All were armed with the Type 95 torpedo, which was superior to American torpedoes in every measurable category during the war's first 2 years. The Type 95 torpedo represented Japanese engineering at its finest. With a 21-inch diameter and a 405-kilogram warhead, these weapons could reach 49 knots at ranges exceeding 9,000 meters. They ran true, maintained depth accurately, and their detonators functioned reliably. When I-26 sank the American light cruiser Juno on November 13, 1942, a single Type 95 torpedo struck beneath the cruiser's magazines. The ship broke in half and sank in less than 20 seconds. Taking 687 men to the bottom, including all 5 Sullivan brothers. Japanese submarine crews were elite personnel selected through rigorous screening. Officers required graduation from the Imperial Naval Academy, 2 years of surface ship experience, and acceptance to the submarine school at Otake, near Kure Naval Arsenal. The 4-month training program emphasized navigation, torpedo tactics, and the aggressive offensive spirit that characterized all Imperial Navy operations. Submariners received better rations than surface sailors, higher pay, and preferential shore leave. They were expected to embody Yamato Damashi, the warrior spirit of Japan, and to press home attacks regardless of personal risk. The submarines themselves incorporated detection equipment that Japanese engineers believed provided significant tactical advantages. The Type 0 Echo ranging set, roughly equivalent to American QC sonar from the late 1930s, could detect submerged contacts at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters under favorable conditions. Japanese hydrophones provided excellent passive detection of propeller noise at even greater distances. The Imperial Navy allocated substantial space aboard submarines for this equipment, sometimes reducing crew habitability to accommodate larger sonar installations. This reflected confidence that superior detection capabilities would provide decisive tactical advantages. Japanese submarines also possessed optical equipment that outperformed American equivalents. Night binoculars, manufactured by firms like Nippon Kogaku, provided exceptional light gathering and optical clarity, giving Japanese lookouts significant advantages during night surface operations. This optical superiority paralleled the capabilities of surface combatants, whose excellent binoculars and trained lookouts had dominated night engagements like the Battle of Savo Island in August 1942. By mid-1941, the Imperial Navy operated 63 fleet submarines, 17 medium submarines, and 3 midget submarines. This force represented years of investment in technology, training, and doctrine. Japanese planners expected these submarines would play decisive roles in the coming war by attriting American naval strength before the climactic surface engagement. The early war successes seemed to validate this confidence. I-6 sank the carrier Wasp. I-19 torpedoed the battleship North Carolina. I-26 sank Juno and damaged Saratoga. These victories confirmed that Japanese submarine doctrine, technology, and training was sound. But these successes masked a more troubling reality that would only become apparent later in the war. The United States entered World War II with anti-submarine capabilities roughly comparable to Japan's. American destroyers and destroyer escorts employed the QC sonar set, which operated on similar principles to Japanese equipment. Both navies understood that detecting submerged submarines was extremely difficult. Both relied primarily on visual observation of periscopes or torpedo wakes, on hydrophone detection of propeller noise, and on active sonar only for final attack confirmation. The technology was similar. The tactical challenges were identical. Neither side possessed overwhelming advantages in submarine detection during 1941. But the Americans possessed something that would prove far more valuable than any single piece of equipment. They possessed industrial capacity that could iterate, improve, and deploy new technology at speeds that would have seemed impossible to pre-war planners. More critically, they possessed motivation. The Battle of the Atlantic, where German U-boats threatened to strangle Britain by sinking merchant shipping faster than it could be replaced, drove massive American investment in anti-submarine warfare research. By 1942, American laboratories, universities, and industrial firms were engaged in coordinated efforts to develop better detection equipment, more effective weapons, and improved tactics for finding and killing submarines. The technologies emerging from this research effort were being transferred to the Pacific theater by mid-1943. Improved sonar sets with better range and resolution. Ahead-throwing weapons like Hedgehog that allowed escorts to maintain sonar contact while attacking. Radar sets capable of detecting surfaced submarines at night. Onobuoys that could be dropped from aircraft to listen for submerged submarines. Magnetic anomaly detectors that sensed disturbances in the Earth's magnetic field caused by large metal objects underwater. Each individual technology provided incremental advantages. Combined, they created detection capabilities that transformed anti-submarine warfare. But technology alone did not explain the increasing success of American anti-submarine forces. The United States was deploying organizational capabilities that multiplied the effectiveness of their equipment. High-frequency direction finding stations across the Pacific could triangulate the position of Japanese submarines from their radio transmissions. Code-breaking operations had achieved partial penetration of Japanese naval communications, providing advance warning of submarine deployments. Radar-equipped patrol aircraft flew systematic search patterns that left few gaps in coverage near major bases and convoy routes. Intelligence officers compiled comprehensive databases of Japanese submarine characteristics, patrol patterns, and tactical preferences. Most significantly, the Americans were creating an integrated system where information flowed rapidly between different collection platforms. A direction-finding station detecting a submarine radio transmission would alert nearby patrol aircraft. Those aircraft would search the indicated area with radar. If they detected a submarine, they would attack with depth charges or bombs while simultaneously alerting surface escorts. Those escorts would converge on the position, using sonar to prosecute any submarine that survived the air attack. Each element reinforced the others, creating a detection network whose effectiveness far exceeded the sum of its parts. By mid-1944, this integrated system had achieved remarkable sophistication. American intelligence officers could predict with reasonable accuracy where Japanese submarines would patrol based on previous operations, fuel consumption rates, and analysis of intercepted communications. Patrol aircraft flying out of newly captured island bases provided overlapping radar coverage of major shipping routes. Escort carriers accompanying convoys gave those convoys their own air support, making submarine attacks far more dangerous. Surface escorts had been trained in coordinated anti-submarine tactics that made escape extremely difficult once contact was established. The Pacific Ocean was being transformed from an empty battlefield, where submarines could operate with reasonable expectation of stealth, into a mapped, monitored space, where every movement was observed, recorded, and analyzed. Japanese submarines departing their bases were detected by coast watchers and reported through intelligence channels. Their transit routes were monitored by patrol aircraft. Their radio transmissions were intercepted and triangulated. Their patrol areas were predicted and covered by additional aircraft. When they attempted attacks, escorts responded with coordinated tactics refined through hundreds of engagements in the Atlantic. And when Japanese submarines were sunk, American intelligence officers added the lessons learned to their growing database of enemy capabilities and vulnerabilities. Japanese submarine commanders operating in this environment during late 1944 were encountering detection capabilities that defied their understanding of what should be possible. American destroyers were finding submarines in conditions where sonar should have been ineffective. Aircraft were detecting surfaced submarines on moonless nights. Escort groups were waiting in patrol areas that should have been secret. The tactical principles that had kept Japanese submarines alive during the war's first 2 years were no longer providing protection. Something fundamental had changed. But without access to American intelligence files or understanding of the integrated detection network, Japanese commanders could not comprehend the scope of that change. They were operating in an ocean that had been turned against them by technologies and organizational systems they did not know existed. I-26 had departed Kure Naval Arsenal on October 25, 1944, with specific orders to interdict American supply lines, supporting the Leyte operation. The submarine carried 14 Type 95 torpedoes, provisions for 60 days, and a crew that had been at sea intermittently for nearly 3 years. Her commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Teramoto Kunikazu, had received his submarine qualification in March 1942 and had served as executive officer aboard I-19 before assuming command of I-26 inches, February 1944. The submarine herself was a Type B-1 fleet submarine, commissioned on November 6, 1941. She displaced 3,356 tons submerged, measured 358 feet 6 inches in length, and could sustain 14,000 nautical miles at 16 knots surfaced. Her pressure hull was constructed of high-tensile steel, capable of withstanding depths to 100 meters operationally, though emergency dives to 150 meters were possible. 8 torpedo tubes, 6 forward and 2 aft, provided offensive capability. A single Type 96 25mm anti-aircraft gun and 2 Type 93 13mm machine guns provided minimal air defense. But by November 1944, these specifications mattered less than they had 3 years earlier. I-26's size, which had been considered an advantage for long-range operations, now made her easier to detect on radar. Her large conning tower provided an excellent radar return. Her relatively slow diving time, approximately 60 seconds from full surface speed to periscope depth, left her vulnerable to air attack. Her lack of radar, which would not be installed on Japanese submarines until mid-1944, and then only on newer boats, meant she operated blind against aircraft that could detect her at ranges exceeding 10 miles. Teramoto's briefing before departure had been sobering. Intelligence officers at Combined Fleet Headquarters acknowledged they possessed limited information about American anti-submarine capabilities in Philippine waters. Radio intercepts suggested the Americans had deployed significant escort forces. Reconnaissance flights, increasingly rare due to American air superiority, indicated patrol aircraft were operating systematic search patterns. Previous submarine patrols to the area had reported aggressive prosecution by destroyers and destroyer escorts. 3 submarines, I-41, I-42, and I-46, had departed for Philippine waters in September and had not returned. The tactical situation facing Japanese submarines in late 1944 represented a complete inversion of the conditions that had existed 3 years earlier. In December 1941, Japanese submarines had operated with reasonable freedom throughout the Pacific. American anti-submarine forces were inexperienced and equipped with unreliable weapons. American aircraft lacked effective radar and carried inadequate depth charges. American naval doctrine had not yet adapted to the reality of submarine warfare. Japanese submarines could surface at night to charge batteries with little fear of detection. They could transmit radio reports without immediately attracting anti-submarine forces. They could remain on patrol stations for weeks while maintaining tactical initiative. By November 1944, every one of these conditions had reversed. American anti-submarine forces had gained 3 years of combat experience, much of it transferred directly from the Battle of the Atlantic. American aircraft carried radar sets that could detect surfaced submarines in darkness or poor weather. American depth charges had been redesigned with faster sinking rates and more powerful explosive charges. American destroyers and destroyer escorts had been built in enormous numbers, with 154 destroyer escorts alone commissioned during 1944. These escorts incorporated lessons learned from hundreds of engagements, with improved sonar, better trained crews, and tactical doctrine refined through constant iteration. The Americans had also deployed organizational capabilities that multiplied their technological advantages. The 10th Fleet, established in May 1943 specifically to coordinate anti-submarine warfare, had developed systematic methods for tracking submarines, predicting their movements, and directing assets to probable contact areas. Intelligence officers maintained detailed files on individual Japanese submarines, tracking their patrol patterns, noting their commanders' tactical preferences, and updating threat assessments as new information became available. Radio intelligence stations across the Pacific intercepted Japanese submarine transmissions, calculated positions through direction finding, and disseminated warnings to forces operating in threatened areas. I-26's patrol orders reflected the deteriorating tactical situation. Teramoto was instructed to maintain strict radio silence except for highest priority contact reports. He was ordered to remain submerged during daylight hours. He was directed to avoid engagement with escorts unless attacking high-value targets. These defensive instructions contrasted sharply with the aggressive doctrine that had characterized Japanese submarine operations earlier in the war. They acknowledged implicitly what Japanese Naval Command would not state explicitly. Japanese submarines were no longer hunters, they were being hunted. The patrol had been uneventful for the first 3 weeks. I-26 had transited submerged through the Philippine Sea, surfacing only at night to charge batteries and ventilate the boat. Teramoto had observed increased American air patrols but had successfully avoided detection through careful timing and immediate crash dives when aircraft were sighted. On November 16th, the submarine had detected a small convoy, 3 merchants with 2 destroyer escorts. But Teramoto had judged the escort strength too heavy to risk attack. The convoy had passed unmolested, while I-26 remained deep and silent. Now, on November 17th, with 4 American destroyers converging on his position despite perfect operational security, Teramoto was beginning to understand that something had changed beyond improved American equipment or training. The Americans were not searching for submarines. They were not patrolling likely areas. They knew where I-26 was with precision that suggested capabilities Teramoto did not understand and could not counter. The depth charges continued to detonate in patterns above the submarine, each explosion sending shockwaves through the hull that made steel plates ring like bells. What Teramoto could not know, standing in I-26's control room as depth charges exploded overhead, was that his submarine had been detected and tracked through multiple overlapping systems beginning 48 hours before the current attack. The detection had begun not with sonar or radar, but with radio intelligence. When I-26 transmitted a brief position report on November 15th, at 2300 hours, the transmission lasted less than 30 seconds, a standard procedure that Japanese submarine doctrine considered safe. Japanese naval communications officers believed that short transmissions could not be triangulated with sufficient accuracy to threaten submarine operations. They were catastrophically wrong. High-frequency direction finding stations at Manus Island, Hollandia, and Leyte Gulf had simultaneously detected I-26's transmission. Within minutes, specialized operators had calculated bearing lines from each station. Where these lines intersected, approximately 25 nautical miles southwest of Leyte Gulf, American intelligence officers had marked a probable submarine position. The accuracy of this triangulation was approximately 5 nautical miles, which was sufficient to direct search assets to a manageable area. At 0300 hours on November 16th, A consolidated PBY Catalina flying boat from Patrol Squadron 33 had departed Leyte Gulf on a routine anti-submarine patrol. The aircraft carried an ASE air-to-surface radar set, capable of detecting surfaced submarines at ranges up to 12 miles in good conditions. The patrol route had been modified to include a search box around the position derived from radio direction finding. At 05:45 hours, the Catalina's radar operator had detected a surface contact at 8.3 miles. The aircraft had turned toward the contact, descending to attack altitude. I-26 had been charging batteries on the surface, her diesel engines running at full power to replenish electrical capacity depleted during the previous day's submerged operations. The submarine's lookouts, despite their excellent optical equipment, had not detected the approaching aircraft until it was less than 2 miles away. At that point, Teramoto had ordered an emergency dive. The submarine's bow had dipped beneath the surface 52 seconds later, just as the Catalina passed overhead and dropped 4 Mark 47 depth bombs set for shallow detonation. The bombs had exploded close enough to damage I-26's port diving plane and rupture several external fuel tanks, but not close enough to cause fatal damage. The submarine had survived, but the attack had accomplished something more significant than physical damage. It had forced I-26 to remain submerged, operating on battery power, throughout November 16th. This meant the submarine could not charge batteries that night. By the morning of November 17th, I-26's battery capacity had dropped to 83%, and Teramoto faced an operational dilemma. He needed to surface soon to charge batteries, but surfacing in daylight invited immediate air attack. The Catalina's contact report had been transmitted immediately to Commander Task Group 77.4, which coordinated anti-submarine operations in Leyte Gulf approaches. The task group commander had diverted 4 destroyer escorts, USS Richard S. Bull, USS Richard M. Rowell, USS Eversole, and USS Coolbar, to search the area. These destroyers represented the newest generation of American anti-submarine vessels. Commissioned in 1944, they displaced 1,400 tons, could sustain 24 knots, and carried the latest QHB sonar sets with improved range and resolution compared to earlier models. More significantly, these destroyers operated according to coordinated tactics developed through 3 years' anti-submarine warfare experience. They did not search independently. Instead, they formed a line abreast with 2-mile spacing, sweeping through the suspected submarine area in systematic patterns. Each destroyer maintained continuous sonar watch. When one destroyer gained contact, the others would converge while the contact-holding ship maintained tracking. This prevented submarines from escaping by simply moving perpendicular to a single pursuer's search pattern. The tactics had been refined in the Atlantic and transferred wholesale to the Pacific theater. At 08:30 hours on November 17th, USS Richard S. Bull's sonar operator had detected a possible submarine contact at 2,800 yards. The contact was marginal, barely distinguishable from background noise, but the operator was experienced and confident. The destroyer's commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander John Roberts, had immediately reduced speed to 10 knots to improve sonar conditions, and had transmitted contact information to the other escorts. Within minutes, all 4 destroyers were converging on the suspected position. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. I-26 had been detected not because Teramoto had made tactical errors, but because the Americans had deployed multiple detection systems that covered overlapping areas. Radio direction finding had provided initial position. Air patrol had forced the submarine down. Coordinated surface search had found the submerged contact. Each system reinforced the others, creating detection probability that approached certainty. Japanese submarine doctrine had no counter to this integrated approach because Japanese Naval Command did not understand that such integration was possible. At 09:22 hours, USS Richard S. Bull dropped the first pattern of Mark 9 depth charges. Each charge contained 100 pounds of TNT and had been set to detonate at 120 feet depth, based on the sonar operator's estimate of the submarine's position. The charges were dropped in a diamond pattern designed to bracket the target, regardless of which direction it moved. 6 explosions hammered through the water in rapid succession, creating pressure waves that reached I-26. Even though the submarine was deeper than the detonation depth, inside the pressure hull, the effect was catastrophic. Light bulbs shattered throughout the boat, cork insulation broke loose from overhead, and rained down on the crew. The submarine rolled 15 degrees to starboard as the pressure wave struck her port side. Electrical systems flickered. In the after-torpedo room, a pipe fitting fractured, spraying hydraulic fluid across the deck. Men grabbed for handholds as the submarine shuddered under forces that seemed to compress the very air inside the hull. Teramoto maintained his position at the periscope housing, his face expressionless even as his knuckles whitened from gripping the metal. He had survived depth charge attacks before. During I-26's patrol off Guadalcanal in August 1943, American destroyers had pursued the submarine for 6 hours, dropping over 40 depth charges without achieving a kill. Teramoto understood that depth charge attacks were as much psychological as physical. The explosions were terrifying, but they had to detonate within approximately 20 feet to cause fatal damage to a pressure hull. Proximity mattered more than quantity. Damage report, Teramoto ordered quietly. Reports came back from throughout the boat. Minor flooding in the after-torpedo room, controllable with hand pumps, electrical shorts in the galley, port diving plane responding sluggishly, possibly damaged from the previous day's air attack. Battery compartment reported no ruptures, no chlorine gas. The submarine was damaged but operational. She could still fight. She could still run. At 0928, the second depth charge pattern detonated, this one closer. The explosions were louder, the pressure waves more violent. I-26 rolled 20 degrees to port before her diving planes brought her back to level. More cork insulation fell. In the control room, a pressure gauge cracked, hissing compressed air, until a crew member shut the isolation valve. The submarine's gyro compass tumbled off its bearing and had to be manually reset. Teramoto watched his crew working through the damage with practiced efficiency. These were experienced submariners who understood their survival depended on calm, methodical responses to crisis. Captain, hydrophone reports screws closing from multiple directions. The sound operator reported. 4 contacts, they are working together. Teramoto nodded. This was expected. American destroyers had learned to coordinate their attacks. One destroyer would maintain sonar contact, while others maneuvered for optimal attack positions. The tactics were effective because they prevented submarines from escaping by simply moving away from a single pursuer. Japanese submarine doctrine had developed no effective counter, because such coordination required communications and training that Japanese anti-submarine forces had never prioritized. At 0935, the third pattern detonated. This time, one charge exploded close enough that the submarine's hull plates groaned audibly under the stress. In the engine room, a coolant line separated, spraying hot water across machinery. The engineering officer shut down the affected system and rerouted cooling through backup lines. The port motor began making unusual noises, suggesting bearing damage. I-26's ability to maneuver was degrading with each attack. Teramoto made his decision. Right, full rudder. Ahead, full on both motors. Make depth 200 meters. The engineering officer's voice came through the voice tube immediately. Captain, the hull is rated to 100 meters operational. 200 meters risks structural failure. Execute the order. I-26's bow tilted down sharply as her motors drove her deeper into dark water, where pressure increased with every meter of descent. The depth gauge needle swung past 150 meters, 175, 200. The pressure hull began making popping and groaning sounds as steel plates compressed under enormous external pressure. Men looked up nervously at the overhead, watching for the first sign of buckling that would indicate catastrophic failure was imminent. At 212 meters, Teramoto ordered the dive stopped. The submarine leveled off at a depth where American depth charges, set for shallower detonations, might not reach her. For 18 minutes, there were no more explosions. The American destroyers overhead had lost sonar contact when I-26 dove below the thermal layer at extreme depth. Their echo-ranging pulses could not penetrate the temperature gradient that refracted sound waves away from the submarine. Teramoto allowed himself a moment of cautious hope. The submarine was damaged but still capable. Battery power was declining but remained adequate for several more hours submerged. If the destroyers gave up their search, I-26 could wait until dark, surface, and escape while recharging batteries. At 09:53, the explosions resumed. These charges were set deeper, and several detonated close enough to send shock waves through the hull that made every man aboard think the end had come. Steel groaned. Rivets popped loose. In the forward torpedo room, a seam in the pressure hull began weeping water. A fine spray that indicated the hull was approaching its structural limits. The depth gauge shattered, leaving Teramoto blind to his exact depth. The port motor seized completely, forcing the submarine to maneuver on one propeller. Teramoto finally understood. The Americans were not guessing his depth. They were not dropping charges randomly and hoping for lucky hits. They were adjusting their tactics based on some form of information he did not understand. Perhaps they had new sonar that could penetrate thermal layers. Perhaps they had some other detection method entirely. It did not matter. What mattered was that I-26 could not escape through depth, through speed, or through tactical maneuvering. The ocean itself had become hostile, transparent, mapped. At 1000 hours, with battery power at 32% and the pressure hull leaking from multiple seams, Teramoto made the only decision that remained. Surface the submarine. Prepare to abandon ship. 26 broached the surface at 10:43 hours on November 17, 1944. Her damaged hull breaking through grey water 24 miles southwest of Leyte Gulf. Teramoto stood in the conning tower as his crew scrambled onto the deck, abandoning the submarine that had been their home for 23 days. The port list was pronounced, nearly 12 degrees, and water was pouring into the pressure hull through seams that had been compromised by depth charge concussions at extreme depth. USS Richard S. Ball closed to 1,500 yards, her 5-inch guns trained on the surfaced submarine. Lieutenant Commander Roberts had ordered his gun crews to hold fire when it became apparent the Japanese were abandoning ship. American naval doctrine emphasized capture of enemy submarines when possible, as intelligence value often exceeded the satisfaction of immediate destruction. Roberts maneuvered his destroyer to recover survivors, while the other 3 escorts maintained watch positions in case I-26 was attempting a ruse. Teramoto was the last man to leave the submarine, as naval tradition demanded. He stood on the conning tower watching his crew in the water, watching the American destroyer approaching to recover them, watching the Pacific Ocean that had become something he no longer understood. Before descending to the deck, he retrieved I-26's codebox from the chart room and weighted them with steel tools. He dropped them over the side, watching them sink into dark water. Then he climbed down to the main deck, where the submarine's list had become so pronounced that walking required careful balance. At 10:17 hours, I-26 rolled onto her port side. Water flooded through the conning tower hatch that Teramoto had left open. The submarine hung suspended for nearly 30 seconds, her bow rising slightly as the stern filled with water. Then she slipped beneath the surface without drama or ceremony, leaving only an oil slick and debris field to mark where she had been. 105 men floated in the water, supported by life vests, waiting for the American destroyer to recover them. The rescue operations took 42 minutes. American sailors threw lines to Japanese submariners, hauling them aboard Richard S. Bull, with an efficiency that suggested considerable practice. The rescued men were searched, their personal effects catalogued, their physical condition assessed by the ship's medical officer. 3 men had been killed during the depth charge attacks. 7 others had sustained injuries ranging from broken bones to severe lacerations. The remaining 95 were exhausted, covered in diesel fuel and hydraulic fluid, but alive. Teramoto was among the last to be recovered. He climbed aboard Richard S. Ball at 11:02 hours and was immediately escorted to the captain's cabin for interrogation. Lieutenant Commander Roberts, who had studied Japanese at the Naval Academy and spoke the language adequately, conducted the initial questioning. The interrogation was courteous but thorough. Roberts wanted to know I-26's operational orders, her patrol area, her communication schedule, and any information about other Japanese submarines operating in Philippine waters. Teramoto provided his name, rank, and service number, as required by international law. He, refused to answer operational questions. Roberts did not press the matter. The intelligence value of a submarine commander's tactical knowledge decreased rapidly as time passed, and circumstances changed. What Roberts really wanted to know was whether Teramoto understood how his submarine had been detected and tracked. The question, when Roberts finally asked it, was direct. "Commander Teramoto, your submarine maintained excellent operational security. You transmitted only once. You remained submerged during daylight. You followed proper tactical procedures. Yet we found you within hours and prosecuted you to destruction. Do you understand how this was accomplished?" Teramoto looked at the American officer for a long moment before responding in careful English. "I do not understand. Your capabilities are not what our intelligence described. Either our intelligence was incorrect, or your capabilities have changed significantly." Roberts nodded. "They have changed. More than you know. More than your naval command knows. The ocean is not empty anymore, Commander. We can see everything moving through it. Your submarines, your surface ships, your aircraft. Everything. The war you trained to fight ended 2 years ago. The war you are fighting now is one you cannot win." This statement, delivered matter-of-factly by an American destroyer captain to a captured Japanese submarine commander on November 17, 1944, encapsulated the fundamental transformation that had occurred in the Pacific War. The technological and organizational superiority that the United States had developed through industrial capacity, scientific research, and systematic application of lessons learned had created capabilities that Japanese forces could not match or counter. Individual courage, superior training, and tactical excellence were no longer sufficient advantages when confronted with overwhelming material and technological superiority. Teramoto and his 94 surviving crew members were transferred to a transport ship on November 19 and taken to a prisoner of war camp in Australia. They would spend the remainder of the war in captivity, removed from combat operations but also removed from the systematic destruction of the Japanese submarine force that would continue throughout 1945. Of the 63 fleet submarines that Japan had operated at the beginning of the Pacific War, only 4 would survive to surrender in August 1945. The rest were sunk by American anti-submarine forces that had achieved dominance so complete that Japanese submarines had become what one American admiral called steel coffins for brave men. The sinking of I-26 represented a single engagement in a campaign that had already been decided by November 1944. Japanese submarine losses had been accelerating throughout that year, driven by American anti-submarine capabilities that had evolved far beyond what Japanese Naval Command understood or could effectively counter. In 1942, the Imperial Navy lost 7 submarines. In 1943, 15 were sunk. Through the first 11 months of 1944, 30 submarines failed to return from patrol. This represented nearly half the submarine force that had entered the war. These losses were not distributed randomly. American intelligence officers had identified specific choke points, where geography forced submarines into predictable transit routes: the Luzon Strait between Taiwan and the Philippines, the approaches to Truk, the waters around the Marianas. In these areas, American forces deployed concentrated anti-submarine assets, aircraft patrols, surface escorts, and submarine barriers that created zones where Japanese submarine survival probability approached zero. Japanese Naval Command continued sending submarines into these areas because operational requirements demanded their presence, despite mounting evidence that such deployments were suicide missions. The technological disparities that contributed to these losses extended far beyond detection equipment. American submarines, which were conducting their own devastating campaign against Japanese merchant shipping, had received radar by 1943. They operated air conditioning systems that made tropical patrols bearable. Their torpedo problems, which had plagued operations through mid-1943, had been solved through systematic testing and engineering improvements. By 1944, American submarines were sinking Japanese merchant ships at a rate that was literally starving the Japanese war economy of raw materials necessary for continued operations. Japanese submarines, by contrast, received radar only beginning in mid-1944, and then only on newer boats. They lacked air conditioning, which degraded crew performance during extended tropical patrols. Their large size made them slower to dive and easier to detect. Their operational doctrine, which continued emphasizing attacks on warships rather than merchant shipping, meant they were seeking the most heavily defended targets while leaving more vulnerable targets unmolested. Even when Japanese submarines did attack merchant ships, they often achieved fewer sinks than American submarines operating in comparable areas with comparable target opportunities. The fundamental difference was not in individual technology or tactics, but in the systematic application of industrial capacity to warfare. The United States produced 154 destroyer escorts in 1944 alone. These ships were specifically designed for anti-submarine warfare and incorporated every lesson learned from 3 years of combat in the Atlantic and Pacific. They were built with standardized components that allowed rapid production. They were crewed by sailors who had trained at specialized anti-submarine warfare schools using the most current tactical doctrine. They operated equipment that had been improved through multiple iterations based on combat feedback. Japan, by contrast, had built only 15 submarines in 1944 and had lost 30 during the same period. The industrial capacity simply did not exist to replace losses, let alone expand the force. The submarines that were being built incorporated some technological improvements, but these improvements lagged behind American capabilities by 18 to 24 months. Japanese anti-submarine warfare remained underdeveloped because the Imperial Navy had not prioritized merchant shipping defense until far too late in the war. The organizational infrastructure necessary to develop, produce, and deploy advanced anti-submarine technology had never been created. The detection network that had found and destroyed I-26 represented capabilities that would only expand during 1945. Operation Barney, conducted in June 1945, saw 9 American submarines penetrate the Sea of Japan, using FM sonar to navigate through supposedly impenetrable minefields. These submarines operated for 2 weeks in waters the Japanese had considered absolutely safe, sinking 28 ships, including a destroyer and a submarine. The penetration was, as American intelligence reports described it, a considerable shock to the Japanese, who had assumed that the Sea of Japan was a safe haven for their merchant shipping. But the shock of Operation Barney was only one manifestation of a larger reality. By mid-1945, the Pacific Ocean had become effectively transparent to American forces. Reconnaissance aircraft photographed Japanese bases daily. Submarines reported ship movements in real time. Radar networks tracked aircraft across hundreds of miles. Radio intelligence intercepted and decrypted Japanese communications with sufficient speed that operational orders were sometimes read by American intelligence before reaching their intended Japanese recipients. The ocean that had seemed vast and empty in 1941 had become a mapped, monitored battle space, where Japanese forces operated with no expectation of strategic surprise. Japanese submarine commanders who survived the war and provided testimony to American interrogators consistently expressed bewilderment at the effectiveness of American anti-submarine operations. They described encounters where American forces appeared to know their exact positions, despite perfect operational security. They recounted patrols where aggressive prosecution began immediately upon entering assigned areas, suggesting the Americans had predicted their movements. They acknowledged that by late 1944, Japanese submariners operated with the understanding that each patrol had a high probability of being their last. Morale deteriorated accordingly. Post-war reports noted instances where submarines spent weeks on station without contacts or reported targets as too far away to attack with suspicious frequency, suggesting crews had lost the aggressive spirit that had characterized operations earlier in the war. The transformation of the Pacific Ocean from empty battlefield to monitored battlespace represented one of the decisive factors in Allied victory. Lieutenant Commander Teramoto Kunikazu survived the war in Australian captivity and returned to Japan in December 1946. He never commanded a submarine again. The Imperial Japanese Navy that had shaped his career and defined his identity had been dissolved. The submarines he had trained to fight were gone, sunk, or scrapped. The doctrine he had studied was obsolete. The war he had prepared to fight had transformed into something unrecognizable while he was fighting it. And by the time he understood what had changed, it was too late to matter. In interviews conducted decades after the war, Teramoto spoke carefully about his experiences. He acknowledged that Japanese submarine operations had been less effective than pre-war doctrine predicted. He admitted that American anti-submarine capabilities had exceeded Japanese expectations. He stated matter-of-factly that the technological and industrial disparities between Japan and the United States had made Japanese victory impossible. Once the initial offensives failed to achieve decisive results, these were conclusions that many Japanese naval officers reached during the post-war period, when access to Allied records revealed the extent of American capabilities that had been deployed against them. But Teramoto never fully articulated what he had understood during those 18 minutes when I-26 dove to 200 meters, while depth charges exploded overhead. He never described in detail the moment when he realized that the ocean itself had become an enemy, that American detection capabilities had transformed submarine warfare into something his training had not prepared him to survive. Perhaps the realization was too profound for easy description. Perhaps the implications were too disturbing to examine closely. Or perhaps Teramoto understood that explaining how completely Japanese submarines had been outmatched would require acknowledging that the samurai spirit, the aggressive offensive doctrine, the superior training that Japanese submariners had been taught to rely upon were insufficient against an enemy who possessed overwhelming material and technological advantages. The story of I-26's final patrol illustrates a larger truth about the Pacific War. The conflict was not decided by individual battles or single technological breakthroughs. It was decided by the systematic application of industrial capacity, scientific research, and organizational capability to the problems of modern warfare. The United States possessed all three advantages in abundance. Japan possessed courage, training, and tactical excellence. But these qualities could not compensate for shortfalls in production capacity, technological development, and organizational infrastructure. The detection network that found and destroyed I-26 November 1944 was the culmination of 3 years of investment in anti-submarine warfare. It represented thousands of engineers designing better radar and sonar. It represented hundreds of intelligence officers analyzing submarine patrol patterns. It represented aircraft manufacturers producing patrol planes by the thousands. It represented shipyards building destroyer escorts faster than submarines could sink them. Most fundamentally, it represented an industrial democracy that could mobilize resources on a scale that no other nation in the 1940s could match. By November 17, 1944, when Teramoto stood in I-26's control room, listening to depth charges explode overhead, the Pacific War had already been decided. The decisive moment was not Pearl Harbor, not Midway, not Guadalcanal. The decisive moment was when American industrial capacity began converting raw materials into warships, aircraft, and weapons systems faster than Japan could destroy them. Everything that followed was the working out of that fundamental disparity. Japanese submarines continued fighting because duty demanded it, because orders required it, because surrender was unthinkable. But they fought in an ocean that had been mapped and monitored by an enemy who possessed capabilities they could not match or effectively counter. The 5 minutes that destroyed I-26, from the first depth charge explosion at 0922 to the decision to surface at 0927, represented the collision between Japanese expectations and American reality. Teramoto had operated according to doctrine that emphasized stealth, tactical excellence, and aggressive spirit. He had maintained radio silence. He had remained submerged during daylight. He had avoided unnecessary exposure. He had done everything correctly. According to Japanese submarine warfare principles developed over 20 years of careful study, none of it mattered. The Americans found him anyway, prosecuted him with coordinated tactics he could not counter, and forced his submarine to the surface, despite his best efforts at evasion. This pattern repeated itself hundreds of times across the Pacific during 1944 and 1945. Japanese submarines would depart on patrol, follow proper procedures, and simply disappear. Their final radio transmissions would be intercepted, triangulated, and filed in intelligence databases. Aircraft would report attacking submarines in the predicted areas. Surface escorts would report depth charge attacks and probable kills. But confirmation was rare, because submarines sank quickly in deep water, leaving minimal debris. They simply stopped transmitting, stopped returning to base, and were eventually declared overdue and presumed lost. By August 1945, when Japan surrendered, only 4 of the original 63 fleet submarines remained operational, the submarine force that had begun the war with confidence in its technology, training, and doctrine had been systematically destroyed by an enemy who possessed advantages that Japanese doctrine had not anticipated and could not counter. The ocean that had seemed vast enough to hide submarines had become transparent to American detection networks. The tactical principles that had been developed through careful study had become obsolete. The aggressive spirit that submariners had been taught to rely upon was insufficient against depth charges guided by sonar and dropped by escorts that could replace losses faster than submarines could sink them. Teramoto's final minutes aboard I-26, standing on the conning tower watching his submarine sink into water that had become his enemy, represented the end of Japanese submarine warfare as a meaningful military capability. The individual courage and tactical skill of Japanese submariners would never be questioned. But courage and skill were not enough when confronted with systematic technological and industrial superiority. The lesson of I-26's final patrol was the lesson of the Pacific War itself. Material superiority, when overwhelming enough and systematically applied, decides wars regardless of the courage or competence of the losing side. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.